Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I just had a 2-hour stream. We had Obama was on here. He was talking about how great the channel was. George W. Bush dropped by. We had the Laker girls dancing behind us. It was quite an event. Don't worry, you did not miss anything. It didn't happen. It did in my mind though. So we're going to go ahead and get into this. This is episode 15, House of History. Battle of Rossbach, 1757. This is the would it be the history of Prussia? Battles of Prussia. Let's get into the video. Kingdom of Prussia faced invasion from every side. Its king, Frederick the Great, was heavily outnumbered. Against all rules of warfare, Frederick led his battered, tired, worn down army against a much larger combined French imperial army. I'll say this. Frederick always seems to start shit. You can't trust him, but the man can win. I give it up to him for that. I gotta put on closed captions. I apologize.
Late summer 1757, the initial campaigning of the 7 Years' War was over. It did not look good for Prussia's King Frederick the Great. Despite a promising start, the Prussian army and its Hanoverian ally lost multiple battles. Optimism crumbled as enemies encroached on Prussia's territory from the north, the south, the east and the west. All the while, the Prussian army suffered enormous losses. The king knew all too well what was at stake. The entire existence of his kingdom was hanging by a thread. In a final desperate maneuver, Frederick took part of his army outnumbered 2-1 against the combined French imperial army. If he lost, it would all be over. The subsequent events culminated in what Christopher Clark describes as Frederick the Great's single most impressive victory.
Okay, let's see
If you like the...
Your search engine has its own agenda, replacing the results you're looking for with ones they prefer. Meet Neva, the search engine.
Cool.
If you like the...
Just a quick question, and I'm sure that there probably isn't. I don't know when Frederick the Great died. So all we have of him are paintings, I'm going to guess? No picture. I don't know when the first picture would have been taken. I'm just guessing we have paintings of him, 1757. He seemed like I'm going to guess, I don't know. I'm going to guess he didn't live until to the 1800s. I'm just...
battle sequence and animations I create for these videos, consider checking out Jordi van de Poet's Learn Adobe After Effects CC for Beginners on Skillshare. This in-depth tutorial course is a great resource for learning animation fundamentals.
Still going?
I consider After Effects to have a rather...
Click the button, I thought.
The late summer months of 1757 held nothing but bad news for the Prussians. In early September, Frederick learned of Field Marshal Hans von Lewald's defeat at Koos-Jägersdorf, the subsequent defeat at the Battle of Moys, and the death of his cherished friend, General von Winterfeld, crushed the king. Bevern retreated to Breslau, where the Silesian front stagnated until November, 3 days after Moys. Hanover and France concluded the Convention of Klosterzeven. It led to Hanover's withdrawal from the war. It opened Prussia's western flank to a combined French imperial army commanded by Prince de Soubise and Prince Joseph Friedrich von Sachsen-Hildenburghausen. To the north, the Swedes, led by Baron Matthias von Ungern-Sternberg, finally landed in Stralsund on September 13, although the Baron was delayed by 4 weeks. Their navy blockaded Stettin, not an ideal position for Prussia, but intelligence told Frederick the Swedes weren't eager to conduct an invasion of Prussia's heartland. Instead, they conducted sieges against Pomerania's strongholds, and that was it. The Reichsarmee, the Imperial Army, wasn't the leading cause for worry either. Comprised of soldiers from many imperial states, 231 political bodies, every house sent its commanders, challenging to work together and heavily decentralized with the...
That's what I'm talking about. You make so many people mad. And yet he's going to win.
Field Marshal maintaining feeble control, the army's efficiency is still debated. On August 30, Frederick arrived at Dresden. Here, Keith maintained a force of some 25,000 soldiers who retreated from Bohemia. These were in poor shape, battered by the constant harassment by irregulars and the elements wearing them down. Frankly, Prussia's army was so weakened that Frederick resorted to deceptive measures to prevent an all-out invasion. For example, the names of Prussian regiments were changed when they moved quarters to confuse enemy spies and inflate their numbers. The next few weeks saw Frederick move around in Saxony, attempting to force a battle against the roaming Princes Soubise and Hildburghausen. During this, Frederick learned of Winterfeld's death. He wrote to his sister that he was so oppressed with grief that he would rather keep his sadness to himself. He was looking forward to dying sword in hand rather than suffering defeat, followed by the tyrannical rule of his enemies. Sorrow is a century, death is an instant. Already after Kolin, Frederick considered suicide. He now proposed a mutual suicide pact to his sister. Fortunately for him, she reminded him that a great genius like yours finds resources even when all is lost, and it is impossible for this frenzy to continue.
I'm not a suicide guy, so I'm gonna hope that he did not. I would understand if he did end himself that way. I would hope he didn't. But damn, sorrow is a century, death is instant. Wow. Wow. That's a good line.
Subordinates did not notice Frederick's depression and suicidal tendencies. Aside from the outpouring of letters to his sister, he resolutely conducted his campaign with steadfastness and calm. And fortune sometimes does work in mysterious ways. Around this time, Frederick learned of Apraksin's withdrawal from the Duchy of Prussia, despite the Russian victory at Groß-Jägersdorf. He immediately congratulated Lewald and ordered him to return to Pomerania to defend it against the Swedes. To a contemporary observer, this would not be enough to reinvigorate Prussia. To illustrate the threat the kingdom's existence hung by, on October 16, a 3,400-strong Austrian flying corps under General Hadik managed to raid Berlin. They faced barely any opposition. Clearly unable to hold the city, they demanded a hefty ransom before leaving the next day. This news was met by Frederick splitting up his army, dispatching Moritz to relieve the capital before moving in that direction. Keith maintained the western frontier, but due to the slow communication at the time, Frederick learned of Hadik's departure 3 days too late, so he turned his army around, returning to Torgau. Moving like this did not exactly improve the army's morale.
No.
The soldiers are greatly fatigued, as it has rained constantly since we left Dresden, and the roads are extremely bad. Many of the Saxons incorporated into the Prussian troops have deserted, but this is no real loss. Frederick still...
Rise of Kingdoms for PC is officially out of beta. Rise of Kingdoms is a history-based strategy
Tell me more.
game available.
Tell me more right now. Oh.
Frederick still assessed Prussia's survival depended on him preventing the French Imperial and Austrian armies from linking up. From Leipzig, Keith reported the French Imperial army linked up nearby them at Mücheln. This was his chance. He rallied his army at Leipzig. Conducting any campaign with this army would be tough, even for the greatest of commanders. To illustrate, Moritz's army had just 5 days to march from Berlin, and Ferdinand's army just 3 from Magdeburg. However, sources reveal what is the most surprising and pleasing at the same time is the spirit the soldiers showed on this occasion. They had marched upwards of 25 English miles a day for 3 or 5 days successively, and at the moment they arrived, they desired to be led into battle against the enemy. Frederick could not pinpoint the exact location of the enemy, but prepared his army for an inevitable battle. On November 3rd, Frederick arrived at Weissenfels. A letter he wrote reveals, "The enemy is assembling troops opposite of me. From my window I can see all his cavalry. The enemy saw him as well." Frederick in person was at the riverbank watching with some frustration as the French burned the covered wooden bridge behind them. 2 enemy officers were watching the royal party from a concealed position on an island which lay within close musket shot range. One of the Frenchmen hastened back to report that it would be possible for a marksman to shoot down a Prussian senior officer, and that this dignitary was probably the king from the respect that was being shown to him. Crillon handed his loyal Brunet a glass of wine and sent him back to his post, remarking that he and his comrades had been put there to observe whether the bridge was burning properly, and not to kill a general who was making reconnaissance, let alone the sacred person of a king, which must always be held in reverence. False intelligence led Frederick to believe his enemy numbered 60,000, outnumbering his force nearly 3-1. This was exaggerated, but the fact Frederick continued to pry for battle just shows how desperate or how confident he was.
Isn't it such a change from then to today to anybody, any foreigners? The early U.S. during its War of Independence went through something very similar. George Washington, several others were on horseback watching an event, watching a battle. They turned around and left. I think there was a withdrawal. The American troops, or the colonists, whatever you're supposed to call them, they took off. And there was a British sharpshooter, I believe, that had what they believe was Washington in his crosshairs. Washington was on horseback going up a hill, leaving the battle, and he didn't want to shoot a gentleman in the back because that wasn't gentlemanly. And you think now, like, if that same, how many of you out there, it's World War II, you've got a sniper rifle, Adolf Hitler's on the scene, he turns around, he starts walking away, you ain't taking that shot? Yeah, you are. It's just, it's so ridiculous how different how we fought wars, how we fought wars just, not even 200 years ago. It's kind of, I don't know. Yeah, over 200 years ago. Sorry, sometimes it's still 1900s to me, apparently. On to the video.
In reality, the Prussians found themselves outnumbered around 2-1 by the combined French Imperial Army. The numbers of soldiers participating in the battle are relatively well documented. The Prussians commanded some 16,600 infantry in 20-some battalions, and 5,400 cavalry in between 32 and 45 squadrons, 22,000 men in total, with 79 pieces of artillery. The French Imperial Army commanded 33,770 infantry in 49 battalions and 7,340 cavalry in 40 squadrons, for a total of 41,110 men. They fielded 114 artillery pieces. Of those, 10,900 troops and 45 guns were from the Imperial Army. Frederick positioned his army between the villages of Pedra and Rossbach, some 4 miles removed from where he assumed the French were stationed. The musicians in the French camp revealed their location. All their complements of musicians, trumpeters, drummers, and fifers now gave sound, as if they had won some great victory. Frederick set up headquarters at Rossbach. His brother-in-law, the Duke of Brunswick, commanded the right wing. General von Seydlitz commanded the cavalry. Preceding the battle.
How pissed do you think Frederick was to hear them playing music and to know that, oh, they're playing like this is going to be nothing, like they're going to wipe the floor with us? Man, that's got to get you going. That has to really contribute to what I think is going to be an ass kicking.
So a crucial miscalculation in the French camp occurred. Their scouts relayed the Prussians were outnumbered and were likely to flee, whereas Prince de Soubise still wanted to proceed with caution, Prince Joseph Friedrich persuaded him to attack the following day. Meanwhile, in the Prussian camp, Frederick miscalculated as well, but in a more favorable way than his opponents. He figured his enemies were about to retreat and viewed their movements accordingly. The following moment, the French Imperial Army moved to the south in 3 columns. They hoped to outflank the numerically inferior army on their left. The columns moved slow and sluggish, with the French cavalry far in advance. The Count of Saint-Germain and Ernst Gideon von Loudon protected the rear, positioned on the hills south of Mückeln. But this movement only strengthened Frederick's belief they were attempting to retreat. Only when the French turned to the east did he reconsider his assessment. Perhaps they were trying to flank his army. He rapidly switched gears, understanding the gravity of the situation if he allowed his enemies to complete their maneuver. Frederick redeployed his army with incredible speed. First, he dispatched his cavalry under General von Seydlitz. Then he ordered Prince Henry and Ferdinand to lead all his infantry from their positions to the southeast and take a position in front of Reikartswerben and Tagewerben. The cavalry moved to the east past the Janusberg before bending south. The long ridge masked their movements. During this move, the Prussian artillery hastened to deploy on top of the Janusberg. Seydlitz appeared in front of the Imperial cavalry, charging them head-on. Both parties clashed, and savage combat ensued.
Did this unit, I mean, I know they were going down, but were they going kind of, it seemed like they were moving slow, or like, maybe they were just moving on down and they figured eventually they're going to flee, so they weren't in any hurry, because it just didn't seem like they were in a hurry to get into a good position. But maybe they didn't know where a good position was. Frederick had already been through here. He knew where he couldn't allow them to be. Maybe that's what it was, because like they're all just taking their time over here, like, yeah, we're going to get there, don't worry. We're going to finish our breakfast and we'll be heading over there.
During this charge, the Prussians didn't enjoy much momentum, and the French cavalry soon moved to aid their imperial comrades. Then the artillery lit up the valley. A deafening bombardment followed, mauling several infantry units. With the arrival of the French cavalry, Seydlitz called in his reserves. These charged head-on against a body of cavalry. Savage close-quarter combat followed. This time, the Prussians enjoyed more success. Their enemy's cavalry began crumbling. They were pushed past Reikartswerben. Around this time, the Prussian infantry vanguard arrived at their destination. The acute angle they positioned themselves in formed the perfect trap for the advancing enemy. Already suffering heavy bombardments, they ran into an awful sight. Their cavalry was mauled to their south. In front of them, the Prussians trapped them. Upon their arrival, the Prussians launched an obliterating volley. Heavily demoralized, part of the infantry barely resisted. The volleys shredded the front lines. Some of the Imperial infantry dropped their weapons and ran. The French infantry launched a few scattered volleys, but the Prussians did not stop.
And they're still firing from up here on this hill too, or mini mountain. And they're just nailing them down in this valley.
Because of their formation in columns, the return fire was wildly ineffective. As the Prussians advanced, the infantry vanguard engaged in ferocious close combat, while large parts of the column deteriorated in an uncontrollable frenzy. It has to be said that Prince Joseph of Saxe-Hildburghausen, despite being wounded, personally led a bayonet charge, a futile attempt, but it evoked even Soubis's admiration. As the first fights erupted between infantry, Seydlitz completed the rout of the French Imperial Cavalry. His horsemen were ideally positioned to the south of the infantry skirmish. He did not order his cavalry to launch a pursuit against the fleeing cavalry. Instead, he ordered the devastating charge into the right flank of the French infantry. As the French were being massacred, the total collapse of the column followed. Within minutes, the column cracked entirely and the infantry retreated towards Pettstadt. A French soldier participating in the battle later described the retreat. Everybody sank into a mob. It was not possible to prevent the flight. The Prussian infantry followed on our heels and fired without checking its advance or having a man drop out of rank or file. The artillery bombarded us without pause. It was only thanks to darkness arriving at 5 p.m. that the slaughter wasn't worse than it already was. In total, the Prussians lost no more than 550 men, of whom 170 were killed. 1 colonel and 7 officers were among the dead. 23 officers and 356 men were wounded. In contrast, the French Imperial Army lost over 10,000 men. Most of them were captured as prisoners. Of those casualties, the French lost some 6,600 men and the Rijksarmee lost 3,552. Among the prisoners were 8 to 11 French generals, depending on the source, 260 officers, and 6,000 soldiers. Among the spoils were 22 standards and colors. The majority of the casualties were French, although the Imperials certainly received a battering. In total, they lost 72 guns, 21 standards, and the bulk of their baggage. The victory was quick, to the degree that most Prussian infantry never even discharged their weapons.
Wow.
Christopher Clark remarks the Battle of Rossbach as Frederick the Great's single most impressive victory. It lasted only 90 minutes, but decided the future of the Kingdom of Prussia. That
It was only 90 minutes?
night, Frederick wanted to lodge in the nearby castle of Burgwerben, only to find it was filled with injured French officers. So instead, he lodged in a servant's room in the village. Clark writes, "In France, the alliance with Austria, and especially the abject defeat at Rossbach, played disastrously with the home public, raising doubts about the competence of the Bourbon regime that would preserve until the revolutionary crisis of the 1780s. A letter by the French foreign minister, Cardinal de Bernis, observes, "More than ever before, our nation is outraged against the war. Our enemy, the King of Prussia, is loved to the point of distraction. But the court of Vienna is hated because it is seen as a bloodsucker of the state." One day after the battle, Frederick wrote to his sister, "That was a tame battle. I can go to my grave in peace because the reputation and honor of my people have been saved. We may still be overtaken by misfortune, but we will never be disgraced." Perhaps the battle indeed was tame to him, but it did change the fortune of his kingdom. Whereas everything had gone wrong for Frederick at Kolin, everything went right at Rossbach. The Prussian army and Frederick the Great's reputation were vindicated. There is an important caveat when considering this comparison. Thomas Blenning writes, "A major difference, of course, lay in the relative caliber of Frederick's opponents. At Kolin he had faced battle-hardened Austrians supported by Saxons seeking revenge for the humiliations inflicted on them by the Prussians during the Second Silesian War. At Rossbach, the French were exhausted after a long march across Germany and disorganized by the persistent looting for which they had become notorious. Even the French commanders were demoralized. A surviving letter by the Count of Saint-Germain does not leave much unsaid. No doubt, you, like me, were able to predict the Rossbach disaster 5 months ago. Never has there been such a defective army, and the first cannon shot determined our route and humiliation. I am leading a gang of robbers, of murderers fit only for the gallows, who run away at the sound of the first gunshot, and who are always ready to mutiny. The king has the worst infantry under the sun, and the worst disciplined. There is just nothing to be done with troops such as these." Rossbach meant Frederick and the Kingdom of Prussia would live to see another day, but to the east, trouble was brewing. As Frederick soon ordered his victorious but tired army on a grueling march to the east. There, exactly 1 month after Rossbach, he would meet the Austrian army at Leuthen. Again, he would be heavily outnumbered. And again, it would be a battle determining the future of Prussia. Thank you very much for watching this video.
Wow, that's pretty good. 90 minutes, 10,000 people. Wow. Not all killed, I understand, but 10,000 people in 90 minutes. Wow. All right. Well, I'm going to end it here. YouTube is giving away free titty jobs if you like and subscribe to my channel. Void were prohibited for everyone who thinks I'm serious.